Montana Territory, November 1881. Nobody noticed what was happening inside Caleb Morrison's shelter. From the outside, it looked like a scar on the hillside, a crude hole scraped into frozen earth, covered with weathered planks and a thin layer of sod. Neighbors rode past without a second glance. Some shook their heads. Others muttered about a man who'd finally given up on civilization. But inside that hole in the ground, something remarkable was taking place. While families in timber cabins burned through cords of pine just to keep their children from freezing, while men rose 3 times each night to feed dying fires, Caleb Morrison sat in his underground chamber in shirt sleeves, comfortable at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, using almost no wood at all. The secret wasn't magic. It was physics, ancient, reliable, and completely misunderstood by everyone who called him a fool. By the end of that winter, the measurements would shock the entire settlement. But first, they'd have to survive long enough to take them. If you want to see how one man's primitive solution outperformed every modern cabin in the territory, hit that subscribe button right now. I promise you'll learn something that could save your life, or at least your heating bill. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Let's see how far this frontier wisdom can reach. Caleb Morrison wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was a trapper, 34 years old, lean from years of walking trap lines through the Bitterroot Range. He'd come to the Montana Territory in 1878 with enough money for 40 acres of timber-sparse land and not much else. The location was good for marten and beaver, terrible for everything a man needed to stay warm. By the fall of 1881, Caleb faced a problem that was slowly breaking him: firewood. The hillsides around his claim held scattered stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, but nothing dense enough to sustain a conventional cabin through a Montana winter. His neighbors settled closer to the river valley, where timber was thicker, could afford to be wasteful. Caleb couldn't. Every log he cut meant half a day's work: felling, limbing, bucking, hauling. During trapping season, that was time he didn't have. His first winter in the original cabin had been brutal. He'd burned through his entire wood pile by February and spent the last 6 weeks of the season burning green wood that smoked more than it heated. His traps went unchecked. His income collapsed. When spring finally came, he calculated he'd spent 90 days of labor just gathering fuel to survive 120 days of winter. The mathematics were unsustainable. His wife, Sarah, and their 2 daughters, Emily, age 7, and Ruth, age 4, had moved back to her sister's place in Helena by the second winter. "Come back when you've got a real house," Sarah had said, and he couldn't argue. The cabin was 14 by 16 feet, chinked with moss that dried and fell out, drafty at every seam. On the coldest nights, ice formed on the inside walls. The girls coughed constantly. Sarah's hands cracked and bled from the dry, smoky air. Caleb didn't blame her for leaving. He blamed the cabin and the fundamental inefficiency of trying to heat a wooden box in sub-zero temperatures with limited fuel. By October 1881, he made a decision that seemed insane to everyone who heard about it. He was going to dig into the earth itself. The idea came from observation, not desperation. In late spring, checking his trapline near a collapsed mine shaft, he'd noticed something strange. While snow still covered the ground outside, the air inside the tunnel entrance was warmer. Not warm, but noticeably less frigid. He'd stepped inside, 20 feet deep, and felt the difference immediately. The temperature was stable, hovering somewhere around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside it was barely 30. He remembered stories from an old Nez Perce trapper named Joseph Red Hawk, who'd once described the winter lodges his grandfather's people had used, semi-subterranean structures dug into hillsides, insulated by the earth itself. "The ground doesn't freeze 6 feet down," Joseph had said. "Doesn't matter what the air does. The earth stays the same." Caleb started reading everything he could find. He learned that miners in California and Nevada had noticed the same phenomenon. Deep tunnels stayed cool in summer, warm in winter. He learned that the Earth's temperature, below the frost line, remained relatively constant year-round, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on latitude. The idea crystallized. If he could build a shelter that used the earth as insulation instead of fighting against winter with thin wooden walls, he could reduce his fuel needs to almost nothing. Not eliminate them entirely. He'd still need fire for cooking, for light, for the occasional bitter cold snap, but reduce them enough that he could trap full-time instead of spending half the winter as a lumberjack. He chose a south-facing slope a quarter-mile from his original cabin, where the hillside rose gently and drainage would be good. The soil was a mix of clay and gravel, stable enough to hold a tunnel without constant shoring. In early September, he started digging. The plan was simple but precise. Excavate a chamber 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the hillside, and 7 feet high at the center. The entrance would be a descending tunnel, angled down and then leveling out, creating a natural cold trap. Cold air would sink into the entry passage and stay there, while warm air would rise and remain in the main chamber. He dug for 6 weeks, moving earth in a wheelbarrow he'd built from scrap lumber and an old wagon wheel. The first 4 feet were easy, soft topsoil and small rocks. Then he hit hard pan, clay so dense he had to soak it with water and let it sit overnight before he could pry it loose with a pickaxe. By mid-October, he had a rough cavity. The walls were uneven, the floor sloped slightly, but the space was there, a dark hollow carved into the hillside, cool and silent, smelling of damp earth and stone. Now came the part that would either save him or prove everyone right about his foolishness. He had to turn this hole into a livable, thermally efficient shelter. And he had to do it before the first serious snow. Caleb Morrison's cave wasn't a cave. It was an engineered structure disguised as a hole in the ground. The first thing he built was the entrance tunnel. He dug it at a 15-degree downward slope for the first 8 feet, then leveled it out for the final 6 feet before it opened into the main chamber. This created a natural airlock. Cold air, being denser than warm air, would flow down the sloped section and pool in the level section, forming an invisible barrier that kept the main chamber insulated. He framed the tunnel entrance with lodgepole pine logs, sinking them into the earth and capping them with a slanted roof of split planks covered in sod. The entrance was small, just wide enough for a man to walk through without ducking to minimize heat loss. He hung a heavy canvas flap on the inside, weighted at the bottom with stones as a secondary barrier against drafts. Inside the main chamber, Caleb faced his most critical decision: how to retain heat with minimal fuel. He'd studied the problem carefully. Wood, even thick logs, conducted heat poorly but provided almost no thermal mass. A log cabin could heat up quickly with a roaring fire, but the moment the fire died, the heat escaped through every crack and seam, radiating into the frozen night. The earth, by contrast, conducted heat slowly but stored it in enormous quantities. If he could warm the earth around him, it would radiate that heat back for hours, maybe days after the fire went out. He started by lining the rear wall of the chamber with stone. He hauled sandstone from a dry creek 2 miles away, flat, angular pieces that fit together like a puzzle. He built the wall 3 feet thick, floor to ceiling, dry stacked with clay mortar mixed from the soil he'd excavated. By the time he finished, that wall weighed nearly 4,000 pounds. In the center of the stone wall, he built a small firebox, just 18 inches wide and 24 inches deep, lined with firebrick he'd salvaged from an abandoned kiln. The firebox opened into the chamber, but its rear wall connected to a narrow flue that ran up through the stone mass and exited through a clay pipe that protruded from the hillside above. This was the key to the entire system. The flue ran through the stone, not around it. Every time he lit a fire, the hot exhaust gases would travel upward through the stone mass, heating it from the inside. The stone would absorb that heat and radiate it back into the chamber for hours after the fire died. It was the same principle as a Russian masonry heater, though Caleb had never heard the term. He'd simply reasoned it out. If he wanted the stone to act as a battery for heat, he needed to charge it efficiently. Running the flue through the stone meant almost no heat escaped and used. For the floor, he laid down 6 inches of crushed gravel for drainage, covered it with flat stones, and then added a layer of packed clay mixed with straw. The clay dried hard and smooth, easy to sweep, and it added another layer of thermal mass beneath his feet. The ceiling was his biggest compromise. He couldn't build it from stone, too much weight, too much risk of collapse. Instead, he used the same technique he'd seen in old sod houses. He laid a framework of lodgepole beams across the width of the chamber, then covered them with split planks, a layer of canvas for moisture barrier, and finally a thick cap of sod cut from the hillside. The sod layer was 18 inches thick, dense, root-bound prairie grass mixed with clay soil. It insulated better than any wooden roof could, and it blended into the hillside, making the shelter nearly invisible from above. For ventilation, he installed a simple chimney pipe that ran from the peak of the chamber up through the sod and hillside, capped with a rotating cowl to prevent downdrafts. When he lit a fire, the hot air would naturally rise and escape through this vent, pulling fresh air in through the entrance tunnel. When the fire was out, he could close a damper in the flue to prevent heat loss. The final touch was insulation for the walls. He couldn't line them with stone, too much work, too much weight. Instead, he packed the exposed earth walls with a mixture of clay, straw, and sand, smoothing it into a hard plaster that sealed out moisture and provided a small amount of additional insulation. It wasn't much, but every little bit helped. By early November, the shelter was finished. It looked absurd. From the outside, it was barely visible, just a low mound on the hillside with a dark rectangular entrance and a thin wisp of smoke rising from a clay pipe. It didn't look like a house. It looked like an animal's den, or a failed mining claim, or the last refuge of a man who'd run out of options. Caleb didn't care what it looked like. He cared what it could do. On November 8th, with the first heavy snow already falling, he moved in. He lit a fire in the firebox, just a small one, maybe 5 pounds of split pine, and waited to see what would happen. The fire burned for 2 hours, heating the stone wall until it was almost too hot to touch. The chamber warmed quickly, rising from the ambient 48 degrees to nearly 70 degrees within an hour. Then he let the fire die. He expected the temperature to drop quickly, the way it did in his old cabin. But it didn't. The stone wall continued to radiate heat, glowing faintly in the dim light. The chamber stayed warm. He fell asleep on a pile of furs near the back wall, and when he woke 6 hours later, the temperature had only dropped to 62 degrees. He checked the entrance tunnel. Cold air had pooled there, just as he'd hoped, creating a barrier between the chamber and the outside world. The canvas flap hung still and heavy, undisturbed by drafts. It was working. Caleb Morrison didn't know it yet, but he just built one of the most thermally efficient shelters in Montana territory. And when word got out, the reaction wouldn't be admiration. It would be ridicule. The first person to see Caleb's shelter was Ben Hutchins, a neighbor who ran a small sawmill 3 miles down the valley. Ben had ridden up to check on Caleb in mid-November, worried the man might have frozen to death in whatever crude shack he'd thrown together. What he found instead was a hillside with a hole in it, a canvas flap for a door, and Caleb Morrison sitting outside in his shirt sleeves, splitting kindling in the snow. "Good God, Morrison," Ben said, staring. "You're living in a grave." Caleb looked up and smiled. "Warmest grave in the territory." Ben dismounted and walked closer, peering into the entrance tunnel. "You dig this yourself?" "Every shovelful." "You planning to bring Sarah and the girls back to this?" Caleb's smile faded. "That's the idea." Ben shook his head slowly. "No woman's going to live in a hole in the ground, Caleb. I don't care how warm you think it is." He wasn't wrong about the social calculation. In 1881 Montana, a man's house was a measure of his worth. A proper cabin, square-hewn logs, glass windows, a stone fireplace, signaled stability, ambition, respectability. A sod dugout or earth shelter signaled poverty, desperation, or worse, a fundamental failure to master the environment. Caleb knew this. He just didn't care anymore. "Tell you what," Caleb said, standing and brushing snow off his trousers. "Come inside. See for yourself." Ben hesitated, then followed him down the entrance tunnel. The moment he stepped into the main chamber, his expression changed. It was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warmth you felt in a well-built house with a roaring fire. But there was no fire, just a small pile of coals glowing faintly in the firebox. "Jesus," Ben said quietly. "How long since you fed that?" 8 hours, Caleb said. I'll have more tonight before I sleep, but I don't need much. Stone holds the heat. Ben walked over to the stone wall and placed his palm against it. It was warm to the touch, radiating heat like a living thing. How much would you burning a day? Maybe 10 pounds. 15 on a cold night. Ben stared at him. That's a tenth of what I'm burning. Less. I know. How cold have been getting outside? At night. Last night dropped to 12 below, Caleb said. In here, it was 68 when I woke up. Ben pulled his hand away from the stone and looked around the chamber. The smooth clay floor, the packed earth walls, the low ceiling of sod and timber. It was dark, lit only by the glow of coals and a single oil lamp. It smelled of earth and smoke and something else, something clean and mineral. It didn't feel like a house. It felt like a bunker, a fortress, a place built for pure survival. People are going to call you crazy, Ben said finally. They already do. No, I mean they're going to say this is dangerous. That you'll suffocate or get buried or, I don't know, something. Caleb gestured to the ventilation pipe in the ceiling. Air moves fine, and the earth's not going anywhere. It's stable. Ben nodded, but Caleb could see he didn't believe it. Not really. He believed the evidence of his own senses, the warmth and the quiet efficiency, but he didn't believe it could last. Something about it felt wrong, felt too simple, felt like the kind of shortcut that ends in disaster. Ben left an hour later, polite but distant, and Caleb knew exactly what he'd do. He'd ride back to the settlement and tell everyone what he'd seen, and everyone would agree that Caleb Morrison had finally lost his mind. He was right. Within a week, the story had spread through the valley like a brush fire. The trapper who'd given up on building a real house and decided to live like a gopher. The man who thought he could survive a Montana winter in a dirt hole with no proper fire. Some of the reactions were genuinely concerned. Martha Greer, who ran the general store, told Caleb he needed to think about his daughters, about what kind of life he was offering them. They need a real home, Caleb, not a burrow. Others were less kind. A carpenter named Douglas Kern, a big man with a reputation for building solid cabins, made it his personal mission to explain why Caleb's shelter was doomed to fail. He held court at the saloon, drawing diagrams on a piece of slate, explaining to anyone who'd listen why Earth shelters were dangerous, inefficient, and fundamentally stupid. First hard freeze. That soil's going to crack, Douglas said, his voice loud and certain. Then the moisture gets in. Then you get collapse. I've seen it happen with root cellars, seen it happen with dugouts. Earth doesn't hold. Not in this climate. Someone asked about the warmth, about the stone wall and the firebox. Douglas waved it off. Sure, it's warm now. Wait till January. Wait till the ground freezes solid and the heat starts leaking out through the ceiling. He'll be burning twice as much wood as the rest of us, just to keep from freezing to death underground. People nodded. It made sense. Douglas was an expert, a man who'd built a dozen cabins, who understood timber and foundations and the proper way to construct a dwelling. Caleb was just a trapper with a shovel and a crazy idea. Even the few who visited Caleb's shelter came away skeptical. They'd step inside, feel the warmth, examine the stone wall, and then shake their heads as if rejecting the evidence of their own senses. It's strange, Caleb, one man said. Just strange. Doesn't feel right. By December, Caleb had stopped trying to explain. He'd invite people inside if they asked, answer their questions honestly, and then let them leave with whatever conclusions they wanted to reach. He had more important things to worry about. His trapline, his firewood supply, and the question of whether this shelter would actually keep him alive through the coldest months. He didn't know it yet, but the answer was about to arrive in the form of a storm that would test every structure in the valley. And when it was over, the measurements would speak louder than any argument Douglas Kern could make. The storm arrived on January 9th, 1882, and it was the kind of cold that made men religious. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, negative 33 Celsius, and stayed there for 6 days straight. The wind screamed down from the mountains at sustained speeds of 30 miles per hour, driving the effective temperature far lower. Snow fell in dense, blinding sheets, piling into drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. People died that week, An elderly couple in a cabin 5 miles south froze to death when their chimney collapsed and they couldn't get a fire relit. A young miner, caught on the trail between claims, was found 3 days later, curled beneath a tree, his face peaceful in the final warmth of hypothermia. For those who survived, the storm became a brutal test of their homes and their fuel supplies. Ben Hutchins, in his well-built log cabin with a stone fireplace, burned through half a cord of wood in the first 3 days. He fed the fire constantly, day and night, stuffing split pine into the flames every hour. His wife and 2 sons huddled near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The temperature inside the cabin never rose above 52 degrees. When Ben checked the woodpile on the 4th day, he realized he had maybe a week of fuel left, and the storm showed no signs of breaking. Douglas Kern, the carpenter who'd mocked Caleb's shelter, fared worse. His cabin was larger, built to impress, with high ceilings and big windows. It was beautiful in summer. In January, it was a furnace that devoured firewood and gave back barely enough heat to keep water from freezing indoors. Douglas burned 3/4 of a cord in 5 days and watched his children's breath fog in the air, even with the fire roaring. He started breaking up furniture, a chair, then a table, then the bed frame, to keep the flames alive. Martha Greer, at the general store, had a pot-belly stove and a good supply of coal. She was warm enough, but she couldn't open the store. The wind had driven snow through every crack in the building, piling it against the door, and the temperature inside the unheated storage room dropped low enough that jarred preserves burst, spilling their contents across the frozen floor. The entire settlement shut down. No one traveled. No one worked. Everyone huddled near their fires and waited for the cold to break. Except Caleb Morrison. On the 2nd day of the storm, Caleb woke at dawn, checked the firebox, still warm for the previous night's coals, and added a single armload of split pine. 5 pounds, maybe 6. He let it burn for an hour while he ate breakfast, then closed the damper and let the fire die. The temperature inside the chamber was 81 degrees Fahrenheit. He dressed in his regular clothes, wool shirt, canvas trousers, no coat, and stepped into the entrance tunnel. The temperature dropped sharply in the tunnel, down maybe 35 degrees, cold air pooling in the level section just as he designed, but never reached the main chamber. The warm air stayed inside, trapped by the weight of the cold air below it, insulated by thousands of pounds of earth and stone. Caleb spent the day working on trap repairs, oiling steel jaws, and splicing wire, comfortable and warm. At midday, he checked the temperature again, 78 degrees. The stone wall was radiating heat. The clay floor was warm beneath his feet, and the shelter felt more stable and secure than any cabin he'd ever lived in. That evening, he added another small fire, just enough to bring the temperature back up to 82 degrees, and then let it die again. 6 days. 6 days of the coldest weather Montana had seen in a decade. And Caleb Morrison burned a total of 40 pounds of firewood. He didn't know yet that this mattered. He was warm, he was safe, and he was alone. He assumed everyone else was managing fine in their proper cabins with their proper fireplaces. It wasn't until the 7th day, when the storm finally broke and the temperature climbed back to an almost tolerable 10 below zero, that the truth began to emerge. Ben Hutchins was the first to arrive. He rode up on horseback, his face red and chapped from the wind, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He didn't say anything at first. He just dismounted, walked to Caleb's entrance, and pointed at the snow-covered mound. "You made it," Ben said. "I did," Caleb said. "You?" "Barely." Ben pulled off his glove and held up his right hand. 2 fingers were wrapped in cloth, the tips blackened with frostbite. "Ran out of firewood yesterday morning. Had to burn the outhouse door to keep the stove going long enough for the temperature to come up." Caleb stared. "Jesus, Ben. How much wood did you burn?" Caleb hesitated. He knew the number would sound impossible. "Maybe 40 pounds. Total." Ben's face went blank. 40 pounds. For 6 days. "The stone holds heat," Caleb said quietly. "I told you." Ben looked at the hillside, at the thin wisp of smoke still rising from the chimney pipe, at the entrance half buried in snow. "Can I see inside again?" They went down together. Caleb lit the oil lamp, and Ben stood in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, taking it all in. The stone wall, the firebox, the smooth clay floor, the temperature that made his frostbitten fingers ache as blood returned to them. "What's it reading in here?" Ben asked. Caleb had a simple mercury thermometer hung on a nail near the entrance. He checked it. 76 degrees. And outside right now? 10 below, last I checked. Ben did the math in his head. 86-degree difference. And the fire had been out for hours. "People need to see this," Ben said finally. "Not just hear about it. They need to see it. Stay with me, because what happened next changed the way people thought about heat, about survival, and about the wisdom they'd been ignoring for generations." Word spread fast. By January 15th, a week after the storm broke, 23 people had made the trek up to Caleb Morrison's hillside to see the shelter for themselves. They came skeptical, armed with questions and suspicions, and they left silent. The first group included Douglas Kern, the carpenter who'd spent the winter mocking Caleb's design. He arrived with 2 other builders, men who knew timber and foundations, men who understood the proper way to construct a dwelling in Montana. They brought a second thermometer with them. They didn't trust Caleb's, and a notebook to record measurements. Caleb let them in without comment. Douglas stood in the center of the chamber and looked around with the expression of a man whose entire worldview was being challenged. "How warm is it?" he asked. Caleb checked his thermometer. 82 degrees. Douglas pulled out his own thermometer and hung it next to Caleb's. They waited 5 minutes for the mercury to settle. Both read the same, 82 degrees Fahrenheit. "When did you last have a fire?" Douglas asked. "Yesterday evening," Caleb said. "Burned for about an hour." "So 18 hours ago?" "About that." One of the other builders walked over to the stone wall and placed his palm against it. "It's still warm," he said, surprised. "Not hot, but warm." "Thermal mass," Caleb said. "Stone absorbs heat when the fire's burning, releases it slowly after the fire dies. Acts like a battery." Douglas pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and started writing. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" "Total, about 40 pounds. Douglas stopped writing and looked up. 40 pounds. 6 days. Give or take. Douglas turned to one of the other builders. "How much did you burn, Frank?" Frank, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, shook his head slowly. 2.5 cords. Maybe more. I lost count after the 3rd day. Douglas did the math. A cord of firewood weighs roughly 2,500 pounds. 2.5 cords. 6,250 pounds. Caleb had burned 40. The ratio was obscene. Frank had burned more than 150 times as much wood as Caleb for the same 6 days, and his cabin had barely stayed above freezing. "What's the ambient temperature in here when there's no fire at all?" Douglas asked. "About 50 degrees, Caleb said. The earth below the frost line stays around 45 to 50 year-round. The shelter naturally settles to that temperature if I don't heat it. And outside right now, 12 degrees. Douglas wrote it all down, his handwriting tight and precise. Then he looked up at Caleb. "Why didn't you tell us it would work this well?" Caleb met his eyes. "I did tell you. You call me crazy." There was a long silence. "I was wrong," Douglas said finally. "I apologize." The measurements continued over the next week. Ben Hutchins brought a doctor from Helena who was interested in the health implications of different heating systems. The doctor measured temperature, humidity, and air quality in Caleb's shelter, then compared it to measurements from 3 different log cabins in the settlement. The results were striking. Temperature stability. Caleb's shelter maintained a temperature between 76 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal fuel input. The cabins fluctuated wildly, from 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the morning before fires were lit to 65 degrees Fahrenheit near the hearth when fires were roaring, with cold spots near windows and walls that dropped into the 40s. Fuel consumption. Caleb was burning approximately 7 pounds of wood per day on average. The cabins were burning between 80 to 120 pounds per day, depending on size and construction quality. Air quality. Caleb's shelter, with its small, efficient firebox and good ventilation, had remarkably clean air, very little smoke, low particulate count. The cabins, especially those burning green wood or low-quality fuel, were filled with smoke that irritated eyes and lungs. Humidity. This was the most surprising finding. Caleb's shelter maintained relative humidity between 40 to 50%, comfortable and healthy. The cabins, superheated by their fires and leaking constantly through cracks, had humidity levels below 20%, dry enough to crack skin and cause respiratory irritation. The doctor wrote a summary that made its way into the territorial newspaper. Mr. Morrison's earth-sheltered dwelling demonstrates heating efficiency far superior to conventional timber construction. His fuel consumption is approximately 1/10 that of a comparable cabin, while maintaining superior temperature stability and air quality. The design merits serious consideration for settlers in fuel-scarce regions. But the measurement that truly shocked everyone came from Ben Hutchins, who'd become obsessed with understanding exactly how much heat the stone wall could store. Ben brought a scale and weighed a sample section of the wall. He calculated that the entire stone mass weighed approximately 4,200 pounds. Using specific heat capacity values for sandstone, which he looked up in a mining engineering manual, he determined that warming the stone from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, the approximate temperature of the stone immediately after a fire, stored roughly 840,000 BTUs of thermal energy. For comparison, burning 1 pound of dry pine releases about 8,600 BTUs. That meant Caleb's stone wall, once heated, held the equivalent energy of nearly 100 pounds of firewood, and it released that energy slowly, over many hours, instead of all at once. "You built a heat battery," Ben told Caleb, showing him the calculations. "That's what this is. The fire charges the battery, and the battery powers your heat for the next 12 to 18 hours. Caleb nodded slowly. He'd understood the principle intuitively, but seeing it quantified made it real in a way that silenced any remaining doubt. By late January, people had stopped questioning whether the shelter worked. Now they wanted to know how to build their own. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in whispers, in quiet conversations over coffee, in men walking their land with new eyes. By February 1882, 3 families in the valley had started digging. The first was Ben Hutchins. He didn't abandon his log cabin. His wife wouldn't have allowed it, but he dug a small earth shelter into the hillside behind his barn. 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, lined with river stone. He used it as a workshop during the coldest months, a place where he could work on harness repairs and tool maintenance without burning a fortune in firewood. The shelter stayed at 65 degrees with a single small fire each morning. His fuel cost for the workshop dropped to almost nothing. The second was a Norwegian immigrant named Henrik Vollen, who'd been struggling to heat a poorly built cabin on the north edge of the settlement. Henrik had experience with turf houses from his childhood in Norway, semi-subterranean structures built into hillsides, insulated with layers of sod. He understood instinctively what Caleb had built. By March, Henrik had excavated a chamber even larger than Caleb's, lined the walls with local limestone, and moved his family in. His wife was skeptical at first. "It's not a proper house, Henrik," but after 1 week of steady warmth and watching their firewood pile barely shrink, she stopped complaining. The third was a widow named Catherine Marlowe, who ran a small dairy operation and couldn't afford to keep heating a drafty cabin on her own. She hired Douglas Kern, the same carpenter who'd mocked Caleb's design, to help her build an earth shelter with an attached root cellar. Douglas worked carefully, incorporating everything he'd learned from measuring Caleb's structure: the descending entrance tunnel, the stone thermal mass, the proper ventilation. When it was finished, Catherine's heating cost dropped by 85%. She told everyone who'd listen that it was the smartest decision she'd ever made. But the real shift happened quietly, in the minds of men who'd built their entire identities around conventional construction. Douglas Kern stopped building traditional cabins. It wasn't a sudden decision, more like a slow realization that he'd been doing it wrong for 20 years. He'd been building structures that looked impressive but performed terribly, burning resources and delivering minimal comfort. The metrics didn't lie. Caleb's shelter, ugly as it was, outperformed every cabin Douglas had ever built. By the summer of 1882, Douglas had redesigned his approach entirely. He He started building hybrid structures, timber-frame cabins with one wall built into a hillside, backed by stone thermal mass, with root cellars that doubled as cold air sumps. They looked more conventional than Caleb's shelter, more like real houses, but they incorporated the same principles of thermal mass, earth insulation, and passive temperature regulation. People called them Kern houses, and they became the new standard in the valley. Douglas never claimed he'd invented the design. He always credited Caleb, always told clients to go see the original shelter first. Morrison figured out, he'd say, "I just made it pretty." By the winter of 1883 to 84, 17 structures in the valley incorporated some version of Caleb's design. Some are full earth shelters dug deep into hillsides. Others were partial, cabins with one stone wall built into the earth, or hybrid designs with underground chambers connected to above-ground living spaces. The fuel savings were staggering. Families that had burned 3 cords of wood per winter now burned 1. Some burned less. The time and labor saved allowed men to focus on their actual work, trapping, mining, farming, instead of spending half the winter cutting firewood. The health impact were harder to quantify, but equally real. Fewer children got sick from a constant temperature swings of poorly heated cabins. Fewer adults suffered from chronic respiratory irritation caused by smoky, over-dried air. The steady warmth of earth-sheltered spaces created environments that were simply more livable. Sarah Morrison returned in April 1882 with Emily and Ruth. She'd heard about the shelter from her sister, who'd heard about it from a traveler who'd stayed in Helena. She came expecting to hate it, expecting to find her husband living in squalor, in some dark hole that smelled of dirt and desperation. What she found instead was a clean, warm, surprisingly comfortable space that stayed at 78 degrees without effort, where her daughters could play on the floor without coats, where the air was clear and the silence was profound. "It's strange," she told Caleb that first night, lying in bed beneath the earth, listening to the absolute quiet. "But it works." "It does," Caleb said. "How did you know it would?" He thought about that for a long time. "I didn't know. I just ran out of other options. Had to try something different." Sarah reached over and took his hand. "You built us a home." By 1885, 3 years after the Great Storm, Caleb Morrison's Earth Shelter had become something of a local legend. Travelers passing through the valley would ask to see the cave house, and Caleb would give them tours, explaining the principles patiently. Thermal mass, earth insulation, passive airflow, the physics of heat retention. Some visitors were engineers or architects from back east, men with formal training who'd come specifically to study the design. They'd take measurements, draw diagrams, ask technical questions about soil stability and moisture management. Caleb answered as best he could, though he never claimed to understand the full theory. He just built what worked. Others were homesteaders facing the same problem he'd faced. Too much winter, not enough wood. They'd come with notebooks and questions, and Caleb would walk them through every detail. The angle of the entrance tunnel, the thickness of the stone wall, the placement of the flue, the importance of ventilation. "It's not complicated," he'd tell them. "You just have to think about heat differently. Not as something you create with fire, but as something you store in mass." The technique spread beyond Montana. By the 1890s, earth-sheltered structures were appearing throughout the northern plains and mountain territories. Anywhere fuel was scarce and winters were brutal. The designs varied based on local materials and soil conditions, but the core principles remained the same. Use the earth as insulation, store heat in thermal mass. Minimize air exchange, let physics do the work. Caleb never patented the design, never tried to profit from it. When people asked why, he'd shrug. "It's not mine to own. People have been building into the earth for thousands of years. I just remembered something we'd forgotten." He was right about that. The principles Caleb had rediscovered weren't new. They were ancient. Indigenous peoples across North America had built earth lodges, pit houses, and semi-subterranean winter shelters for millennia. Settlers in sod houses on the Great Plains had used similar techniques. What Caleb had done was refine those principles with a builder's precision and prove their effectiveness with measurements that even skeptics couldn't ignore. The shelter still stands today, more than 140 years later. It's been modified, reinforced, updated with modern materials, but the core structure remains intact. The stone wall still radiates heat. The entrance tunnel still traps cold air. The Earth still insulates with the same passive efficiency it did in 1881. Visitors sometimes ask if it's livable by modern standards. The answer is yes. With minor improvements, better insulation, modern ventilation, LED lighting, the shelter would be perfectly comfortable year-round. In fact, it would outperform most contemporary houses in terms of energy efficiency. The fuel consumption would still be minimal. The temperature would still be stable. Because the physics hasn't changed. Heat still flows from warm to cold. Thermal mass still stores and releases energy. Earth still insulates. The principles Caleb Morrison used in 1881 are the same principles engineers use today when designing passive houses, earth-sheltered homes, and net-zero energy buildings. The only thing that's changed is that we forgot for a while, forgot that the Earth itself could be a tool, that simplicity could outperform complexity, that solutions didn't always require more resources, just smarter use of the resources we already had. Caleb Morrison wasn't a genius. He wasn't an engineer. He was a practical man who faced an impossible problem and solved it the only way he knew how, by observing, by experimenting, by building what worked instead of what looked right. He wasn't being primitive when he dug into the earth. He was being practical, and sometimes that's the same thing as being brilliant. If this frontier wisdom changed how you think about heating, efficiency, or survival, drop a comment below and tell me. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Maybe you've got your own story about making do with less. I'd love to hear it. And if you want more deep dives into forgotten survival techniques that actually worked, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we uncover another piece of practical wisdom that the modern world overlooked. Thanks for watching. Stay warm out there. This script presents a historical reconstruction based on documented earth shelter construction techniques used in 19th century North America. While the thermal principles discussed, thermal mass, earth insulation, passive airflow, are scientifically accurate and well-established, specific characters and scenarios are fictionalized for educational storytelling purposes. Modern earth-sheltered construction requires proper engineering, compliance with local building codes, attention to moisture management, structural reinforcement, and professional guidance. This content is educational and historical in nature and should not be used as a substitute for professional architectural or engineering advice. For viewers interested in earth-sheltered or passive solar design, consult with licensed professionals and refer to current building standards in your jurisdiction.